Hey, fellow unwatchers.
Hey,
If you're like me, there's few things more unwatchable these days than the Academy Awards.
we are the same.
That's why this year we've decided to suffer through the entire self congratulatory celebration of mediocrity the way we always do, together.
Ow!
Join us on Sunday, March 12th. Sorry. Join us on Sunday, March 12th for the first annual Unwatchables Oscars live stream. We'll have a number of special guests to help us survive the night. Plus, you'll be able to interact with us, share your own gripes and personal picks, and maybe even see something awful happen on stage. Check our Instagram, Twitter, or any of our online platforms for details. It's going to be the movie's biggest, most boring, and most insufferable night. We'll see you March 12th.
Hey, can I come?
Hello and welcome to Unwatchables, the film podcast where the living is easy, but the films are not. I'm Marc Dottavio.
I'm Seth Troyer.
And today we're joined by Marya E, prolific film writer for sites such as RogerEbert.com and expert on female filmmakers, for what many consider one of the most daunting of all classic films, both for its epic running time and lack of traditional narrative or action. It was recently voted #1 on Sight and Sound's poll of the greatest films of all time, unseating titles like Vertigo and Citizen Kane, and of course inspiring temper tantrums from all the usual suspects on the internet. That film is Chantal, Akerman's 3-hour and 20-minute minimalist art film and feminist touchstone, Jeanne Dielman. Get comfy, there will be no pee breaks.
That's not true. We can anytime we want.
I might have messed part of that, but either way, our guest today is Marya E, whose writing and interviews can be found all over the internet. Just a few of those places are RogerEbert.com, Crooked Marquee, The Playlist, Vulture, Nerdist, and her own Substack, which you can go subscribe to right now. She is also the originator of the annual tradition of Noirvember, as well as A Year with Women, the year she spent watching only films made by women. Her latest projects include a book about female directors, so who better to discuss Jeanne Dielman and its controversial rise to the top of the Sight and Sound list? Marya, we are honored.
It's great to be here. I love this movie a lot. So I actually watched this for the first time during A Year with Women. So
oh, really?
It was a monumental year. Yeah. It was Akerman was one of those filmmakers that I always heard of, but I was like, oh, her films are hard. And then I watched them and I'm like, her films aren't hard if you get on her like wavelength, which is I guess the struggle for a lot of people is getting on the wavelength, but they're great.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do find them, just the prospect of it, intimidating. And this was my first time seeing this film, and I watched a bunch of other Akerman films in preparation too. And I definitely agree with you.
Did you watch Hotel Monterey?
I did not, but Seth, you saw that, right?
I love that one.
Hotel Monterey has no soundtrack, no sound, nothing.
Barely any people in it. It's rooms.
Fantastic. But it's right, definitely like, that's a good way to get your feet wet, because the first time I watched it, she broke me and I had to put like jazz music on in the background. And then I was like, okay, that's not how she wanted me to watch it. So I watched it again without music and it was easier the second time.
You get chills the whole time. It's like sitting in a room and just actually like what you're doing. It just reminds you of what you're doing, which all her movies kind of do that, which is you are just sitting in a room with yourself with various elements surrounding you, and there's a screen doing things, but it's kind of a wonderful thing that it draws attention to that almost. While it's still like kind of, I don't know, zones you out in sort of this weird way, like you feel hypnotized by these kind of
That's a great description, I think, hypnotized.
That's a short, right? Do you remember how long that is?
I want to say it's like 35, 40.
Yeah, it's a weird one. It's not short, but it's not it's not feature.
Yeah, it's technically a short,
a novella,
but it's not that short. Let's see. I'm like looking it up. Oh, they count it as a documentary. It's actually 62 minutes. 62 minutes.
Oh, okay.
It's like right on the
So depending on where your cut is, you could technically call it a feature. So I don't know.
Long-time listeners might remember that when we did an episode on Stan Brackage's Dog Star Man, that I could not bear to sit in silence and watch that, and so I put on ABBA Gold for that one. So we endorse self-soundtracking films on this podcast, I would say, but good move probably watching that the way it was meant to be seen.
Yeah, I have a really hard time when there's no soundtrack whatsoever. I find that very harder than anything else, honestly, to get through. So I was a little scared about Hotel Monterey, but I don't know, I might have to give it a shot at some point.
It's definitely hypnotizing, like you said, by the end. And it's these like hotels in New York that most of them don't exist anymore. So it's also sort of like a postcard or not a postcard, but like just a vacation to the past kind of, which is fun.
Yeah, and that's actually Stan Brakhage is a good person to mention here too, because just to give a little background about Chantal Akerman for anyone who's listening who maybe isn't familiar, she is a Belgian filmmaker, or was a Belgian filmmaker who was born in Brussels and made a lot of films that took place there, including the one that we're talking about today. And she did spend some time in New York when she was starting up her film career, where she was influenced, from what I understand, by avant-garde filmmakers like Stan Brakhage and Michael Snow, who actually just died on January 5th, I believe, of this year. And so if you're, listening to us talking about the kind of films that she was experimenting with at the time, ones with no sound, ones with lots of very still shots and lack of action. She was very much part of this kind of scene of experimental filmmaking. And so, there's a lot of different terms that you can throw out there. It's different movements that she's kind of at this intersection with, whether you're talking about minimalism, structuralism, slow cinema, modernism, things like that, but also feminist and queer cinema. It's hard to really narrow her down, I think, because many things are in play.
She very much did not want to be narrowed down. She was also Jewish, so there's many layers of art movements and cultural just places that she was born post the war, or was a war baby. I forget the exact date, but her mother went through the war, and I think the character in Jeanne Dielman talks about being like a teen in the war, and that's definitely that post World War II Europe sensibilities are definitely in here as well. It's a lot. It's a great film. There's a reason it's so high. It's because it's a lot, because it's so many different things. It speaks to so many different kinds of filmmakers,
which I'm sure is like an interesting thing for people who haven't seen the film yet to hear us speak like this about it. When if they read the Wikipedia or something, like just a little snippet of like, what is this thing? It's often described as what at least most of it is, which is we are just watching a woman in her day-to-day life as sort of a housewife, keeping the home. Maybe the wildest thing in the day is going out, getting groceries, making food. And the biggest thing is that if she's making the food, we're watching her from ingredient one to like pulling it out of the oven almost, to like making the whole thing, or washing all of the dishes in front of us and
eating it at one point.
Yeah,
which of course sounds very dull and like boring from like from an American film standpoint, right? Like that's what's so interesting about the film, that it does contain there's so many elements in it, and it's hard to, which we'll try to on this podcast, it's hard to describe what exactly it is that elevates it from
I would recommend
a documentary or some kind.
not reading anything about it before going in, because I read one piece before I watched it and it spoiled. You don't feel like this movie should not be spoiler, but it is, and it was disappointing. So I recommend not reading anything.
I'm glad you said that, because we usually do spoil things eventually on this podcast, but so be careful, listeners.
Yeah, there may be spoilers, but what's interesting, I've watched this film probably 6 or 7 times now, and twice this year, because I watched it. My boyfriend, fellow critic Robert Daniels, had not seen it, and he was prepping. We both submitted Sight and Sound ballots, and he was prepping almost the whole year. He didn't know if he was going to get a ballot. He actually was just trying to watch as many from the previous list that he hadn't seen, and for when the new list came out, so that he'd be, like, caught up or whatever. And I had done this like 10 years ago because I had no life 10 years ago. And that was pretty much all I did was watch movie lists, but I had seen Jeanne Dielman already and he hadn't. So I was like, I want to watch you watching it. So we watched it, I want to say in like May or June. And then when it hit the list, the Gene Siskel here had shown it, I think in January, February, and they re-showed it a couple weeks ago. And so we got to watch it in a theater with people, which was a totally wild experience, which I would love to talk about at some point when we get to that on this show, because it was probably top 5 experiences of just almost more watching the audience than watching the movie.
Sure.
But in watching it twice in this year, twice within 6 months, really, what's fascinating about it, and it's like the first time you watch it, it helps you get on the rhythm. And then the second time you watch it, you're really noticing that what seems like little unconsequential details, because it's 3 days of quote unquote repetition, you notice what little details actually are her emotions, or when something becomes off, because on the first day she does it one way, and on the next day she does it another way. And because she's so immerses you on that first day with all the little details, the second day, the few things that are off, you're like, oh no. And by the third day, you can really see her losing it. But it's such a controlled performance that it's in little movements where it's just, she slams the plate down just a little bit harder than she did the first day or the second day. Little things like that where you're like, oh no, if there was a dog in this house, she would be kicking it right now. And I think it says a lot about how smart Akerman was, that she reveals that about this character through things that we take for granted, or the things in definitely American movies that we would consider non-action, even though anyone who's living a life knows that like doing the dishes is an action, right? It's just the stuff that was never deemed worthy of a film, even though that's where the human condition lies.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's exactly where the brilliance in this movie lies, and that it has to be this long and this drawn out to have this effect. That's a very purposeful thing, and that the duration of everything is exactly the point. So it's 3 hours and 20 minutes, and it's not a second too long. And it depends on that, I think. And that was exactly my experience watching this for the very first time yesterday, actually, where, where you do start to recognize these parts of her routine and anticipate it. And that's exactly what Akerman is using in order for you to observe her behavior and clock these changes without it being spelled out in dialogue or any other kind of exposition. With a few little exceptions that we can get to. But you're right that when you start seeing these little deviations, they register so strongly. And I mean, it got me to the point when Seth and I were watching this, that, we're a few hours in, and her suddenly dropping a shoe polishing brush or a dish is like, oh shit. It's like seeing an explosion.
Biggest jump scare ever. Yeah. It's amazing.
It's absolutely shocking. Which,
but if you describe it doesn't sound interesting. But when you watch it, like it really is.
Because it really does such a great job of mimicking life, everyday life, which those things are very quote unquote boring to a Hollywood audience or something. But in your everyday life, like you dropping something, it's like jarring for you and can really set you off because you're like you are in your thoughts and you're going through your day. And yeah, just one little thing can really set you off. And you may and it's not always even that visible, but you're so locked into her thought process at a certain point that you almost feel like you can read her thoughts or something.
And what's so jarring on that I guess it's the third day, is you only get 2 mornings, and the first morning is almost like a dance. Her making the coffee, her getting her kids' shoes ready. She's in it. She's done this a million times. She's dancing. She's found the grace of her day. And when things start to go wrong, that grace it is like the shoe polish going is like seeing a ballerina like miss a toe thing. I don't know ballet stuff. That was a bad metaphor because I don't know ballet things.
No, that's pretty good.
Taking a tumble,
I'll go to football. I know football a little bit. It's like, you've seen someone throw the pass a million times and they always catch it, and then that one time they don't, you're like, oh my God, you've caught that pass 100 times. It's like that. It's that jarring.
Yeah. She puts the I remember at one point me and Marc were watching it, and I was just like, I almost shrieked because she put the plate down when she's doing dishes and there's still suds on it. And
and it takes her a while to notice.
And then you're like, no, there it is. It's like in a horror movie where you're like, he's behind you or something.
But it's the suds, yeah.
It's just suds. And then she takes it and she washes it off. And okay.
Yeah. And again, I mean, we pretty much dove right in, and Seth kind of summarized it before, that this is a very strictly structured 3 days in the life of this character and her domestic routine, which includes cooking, eating, cleaning, taking care of her school-age son, who, boy, doesn't do anything but show up and eat her food and lay down.
Begrudgingly eat her food.
Yeah. Never has anything to say to her, really. Except a weird little thing he gets into towards the end. But yeah, she does shopping and errands, and maybe the thing that sticks out the most is that these clients show up that she has sex with for money, which we don't actually see happen until the very end. But and again, it's not something that we get any information about how this started. But we do know that her husband is no longer alive. So this is clearly something that's helping her continue to make money. But that's another detail we don't get, is exactly what happened to him, unless I missed that.
I don't think so. I think you just kind of go with it.
Yeah. And quite often, like, part of the ritual is like taking the money and putting in this jar. And I think almost each time, like, she winds up taking it out and giving it to the son. The money that she got for having sex with these Johns, which again, like the days are these things that you follow, and the first day being the first John seems like it goes off okay. Like it's again part of the routine, and the big thing is with the second day, one of the Johns, it seems once she leaves the room, her hair's just a little frizzed up and a little messed up, which she spends a lot of time combing it throughout the movie, and that's one of the big moments is like the son notices, makes one little remark, which again, like, not much is said between them. So every little thing that is said is like, you like stand up in your chair when you hear it, and you like, okay, they're talking, like, are they going to get to something here? And he notices, and she tries to brush it off, but you can tell it's starting to wear on her, this life. It's one of the things.
Yeah.
And the way this movie is shot is very similar to a lot of her films, whether they're even her more conventional ones or her experimental shorts, where there are lots of long takes. This movie, it's all static shots. I don't believe the camera ever moves.
No, I think it's all static shots, pretty much.
And I know a lot of her other movies, I've noticed, have these kind of lateral tracking shots that happen a lot throughout them. And this is kind of unique in that it does stay locked down the entire time, which is appropriate. And she returns to the same camera setups for each chore, which is, again, kind of training you to get into her mindset, which is very clockwork and very routine. And the camera placement is almost the same as that. And
the few times that it does change is in moments where you're getting a little more emotion from Jeanne. Like, I think it's in the third day, it moves the setup from the head onto the table, it moves to like the other, like not even the other side where she's doing the potatoes, but like from the other angle altogether. And you're like, what is this angle? Oh no, this cannot be good. So she uses the static the same way that the little things that are off about her day, she uses the static camera. And then the minute that she changes, you're like, oh no, this is, which is, I think you mentioned it's a very like formalist film in that when there are things that are changes in the way she's making the film, it's to highlight a change in an emotional state, and it's like really brilliant. There's a few cuts that are like that too, where there's not a lot of edits, but when there is a quicker edit, you're like, oh no, this is not good. Things are not going well.
It does feel like magic, like some kind of magic trick, the way she can call attention and like pull you in and out of trances, sort of, in these sort of like, which make these like very static, seemingly like dull, even like sequences seem riveting, because it is like it feels like she is somehow directing attention with either sound or gesture, just because of like the way time is used in that way, that we are sort of just like easing into every action. I think that is just so potent about it. And in a way that doesn't necessarily, I like a lot of her other movies, but in this one, it just seems like the perfect way of doing what she's doing, because of the aspect of the structure, I think. I don't know what you guys thought of the structure, but like the fact that it's in days even is like this, it adds to the idea of routine and cycles and training the audience. That I think is just like the most perfect way of doing a slow cinema joint, you know?
Yeah, I think the structure goes back to my very failed attempt to talk about dance. But it feels like she does the same things over and over again, the same way a dancer would do things over and over again. And I think she's trying to call attention to the fact that this is a profession, not just her, side hustle of sleeping with men for money, but her homemaking is a profession, or an art even, that she has for the most part perfected until the moment that it flips, and suddenly she's just lost it. There was a film earlier this year, just came to me, called Girl Picture, and there was an ice skater in it, and she had lost her Lutz, and she couldn't bring it back. She couldn't skate the way she was supposed to. Just couldn't find it again. And I feel like that's kind of what happens halfway through this movie, is she loses the art that she had, and she loses the control that she had, the same way that an artist or an athlete could. And sadly she never gets it back, spoiler alert. And you feel really bad, because you are so mesmerized in that first section where she really has it down to an art, and then you're like, what is her life gonna be in the next 3 days?
I'm glad you brought it up, of it being like a profession, her life being a profession, because it is like she does seem very, even though it is technically set in the 70s, I'm pretty sure, she does seem very old world even then. Like they don't have like a TV, and she's very set in her role as homemaker, very much so. Like she has no like spare time for herself, really. Like it just, if she does, it's like, well, I guess now I'll pick up these little knickknacks and
dust them. Yeah, she
like you imagine what your grandma's life is, you know, and it does, like, especially for a male viewer watching it, like growing up with a mom who was a suburban mom, that was definitely doing a lot of those things for me, I think, and I never like thought about, but it is like this almost eerie like window in, and it also like this sort of like, it's a strange thing that people like, that someone would do that for someone to that extent.
Seth's mom polished his shoes every night.
I've seen a lot of men talk about this movie who'd seen it and don't like it, who are like, I don't like doing dishes myself, why would I want to watch it? And I was like, that's the point.
Yes.
Who was doing your dishes when you were a kid? Have you ever thought about that? Like, no. There was a guy sitting next to me at the Gene Siskel version who, this movie literally broke this man. I saw this man break. He was there with his wife. He was very excited. Older, I think 50s, 60s maybe. And about 5 minutes in, he fell asleep. Slept for about 20 minutes. So he missed the whole getting into the rhythm, right? Then he woke up. Then every time she would do these long takes, he would just like make these noises. He was so frustrated. He was like, this is boring. And I could see him just like feeling how boring it was. But part of it was he fell asleep. So he missed the part where you get mesmerized. Then at one point he took his shoes off. And then at another point when she, we were talking about the shoe polish, he's like, finally some action. And I was like, I'm going to murder you. Like, I need you to stop. But then by the very, very end, when the end happens, I saw exactly what Chantal wanted from him happen. And he was like, and I was like, I bet he likes this movie now. But maybe he doesn't. I don't know. But I feel like, I feel two ways about watching this guy watch this movie. Is I don't think he ever got on the rhythm. So he never understood what she was doing. He resisted it the whole time instead of letting it in. But then when he did finally let it in that last 20 minutes, like I could see it get him in a good way. And I was like, but he's going to probably still say he hated it. And it was fascinating to watch.
It makes you wonder how
he might be like,
that
movie. Was a wonderful film. I really felt every bit of it. And then you'll be like, I saw you. You were sleeping.
Yeah, I didn't see what his conversation with his wife was afterwards, but she was riveted, which makes me wonder maybe she's going to talk to him when they get home. Like, I hope so. You need to listen. But it was fascinating. There was a woman sitting in front of me who was in her 20s, I think, and she came in and then about an hour in just left. She's the only walkout, but I guess she realized it was not for her. So hopefully she revisits.
Especially if you missed the latter half or even the last hour, you're really not going to understand what the whole point is.
It's definitely one of those movies. You just have to give it the 3.5 hours, and it is worth it when you do. I feel like it's worth it all the way through, but it's definitely worth it to get to the end. And then you understand the beginning. But if you don't stick it out, then maybe you do have a misunderstanding of what is happening there, and it is quote unquote boring.
It's
interesting.
Hard to imagine someone wandering in without some sort of being prepped for what exactly they're in for and being surprised by it.
The funniest thing was they were talking about the next thing Gene Siskel was doing was these I don't know what they're calling it, but it's movies that are 6 hours or longer. And so they're doing Out One and Satan Tango and all of those. And he was like, we'll go to the 10-hour Napoleon or not Napoleon, War and Peace. And I was like, you can't sit through Chantal Akerman. You're not gonna sit through Russian 10-hour Napoleon. Let's be honest.
Yeah, and I think that especially if you watch a lot of movies, that something that's just a little over 3 hours really isn't that bad.
No, we had just done Jonas Mika's a few weeks earlier, the 5.5 hour movie that he has, and this is a piece of cake compared to how long that they had to put an intermission in the middle of that one because people needed to go to the bathroom.
Well, yeah, I think that people are maybe sometimes more scared about just knowing, well, I don't want to watch first 10 straight minutes somebody washing dishes or something. But I don't know, as the person who just saw this for the first time, I really don't think that it should be as intimidating for people, because I found it extremely watchable and I was riveted the whole time, even during the early parts. And I think that that's what Akerman is doing, that she's not as extreme as a Stan Brakhage or somebody, that in a movie like this, she's really bridging the gap between experimental filmmaking and just a psychological character study. And in that way, there is a narrative, there is character development, and there is a rigid, exacting structure to it with a climax and an endpoint and a purpose. And I really don't think that it's that hard to get into.
No, I would agree. I think it is a psychological character study, and there are you have to have that hour with her to understand how her character is changing so quickly in the next day and a half. And it's there. It's just, I feel like part of it is the way the film is discussed in like shorthand, like obviously in like academic circles or film circles, it's talked about within the context of Akerman and the various schools of thought. But I think for lack of a better word, for normies, it really is like, oh yeah, you just watch her make a meatloaf, you watch her doing dishes, and that does sound. It's not talked about as the way you put it, a psychological character study. It's the movie where this woman makes meatloaf, and that's how people describe it, which does a disservice to what it actually is, even though yes, you do watch her making meatloaf.
Looks pretty good too.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it wound up being this really, the length is freeing for me. And granted, I have a background in watching a lot of these kind of movies, but at the same time, like, I know, like, probably the reaction of a lot of American audiences is that, like, well, shit, like a lot happens in 90 minutes of a movie. Like so much happens in 90 minutes of a movie. Like how, I would just get so tired of it by like the start of hour 4, right? But the opposite occurs here, is in that like the clutter is taken out so that it's even an easier sit for me. Like me and Marc kept on bringing it up, and it felt like pretentious to say it, but like it was like, this is easier to sit through than like some of the 3-hour like Marvel movies, because
Yeah,
like,
there's
just even if you like that, you're like exhausted, like in a certain respect, because you're just like, okay, I gotta keep up with this thing, and this is happening, and then okay, so there was that twist, and this guy is like this guy's brother, right? And that is not what's happening here.
You don't need any of that. You barely have, like, you have her son, you have the one letter from her sister, you have a few shopkeepers. That's about it. That's all you have to pay attention to. You're good. That friend that she runs into that she clearly does not want to hang out with, I love to think about, like, why does she not want to hang out with this woman?
Yes.
Who is so excited to hang out with her, and she's like, no. Oh, and the neighbor who cannot cook to save her life with the baby.
Yeah.
She's always got to watch the baby, and then there's that scene where she's watching the baby, and the baby's just shrieking, and you just have to listen to the baby shriek.
I had never seen it on the big screen. I'd only seen the Criterion Blu-ray. The sound design on the big screen with the baby shrieking, her feet on the waxed floors, which that guy that I was sitting next to at one point, when he got really, like, he basically threw a temper tantrum and started stamping his feet on the floor to mimic hers. And I was like, you are like in your 50s at least. You should not be having a temper tantrum. But the sound design of that, the sound design of the dishes, it was really, it added a whole other layer and I'd seen it several times on the Blu-ray, and on the Criterion channel, but the sound mix on this, I think it was a DCP that they played, I was like, wow, this is like a whole other layer to this movie, is the cacophony of sounds, because it's not a busy movie in terms of shots or editing, but there's a lot of sounds,
Yeah, and I don't want to overlook the central performance here too, because again, it's another thing where you can imagine, you know, showing up to set and be like, all right, I got like a lot of work to do today, you know, in this kitchen. But like you said, in those early scenes, she does it with such a like swiftness and elegance, like she's a professional who is doing this and is really into it. And in a way, this is a much more challenging performance than a more conventional one, because all she has to work with is this time and movement, and isn't expressing these things through dialogue. And I found it to be really astounding to clock these things on her as we're slowly going through. And you can a lot of times it's just like the look on her face, or she's not even overplaying a scene. Even if it's later on, as she's getting pretty deep into her breakdown, she'll still have these moments where she's holding back, or it looks like she's trying to be nice to this baby, which I was starting to get really nervous when she was with that baby. And
she's like shaking the baby.
Yeah. I was starting to get scared for that baby.
No, yeah. How often do you see an actor just sit and try and act out what it's like to sit and think about something?
Yeah.
And she does it, which is something that we all do constantly, like silently, sometimes for minutes and minutes, just like sitting or like while we're doing things. Even the action, like one of my favorite things in the movie is the thing that I do, and I think everybody does at least a few times a day, where you like enter a room and you're like, wait, why did I come in here? What did I no? Or like I forgot the thing that I was, and then she goes back and grabs it and then re-enters the room. And again, those things wind up being like, again, like charged as it goes along, as she starts to again do those things. But I think it's just amazing to watch that, where other actors would be praised for like having some long diatribe that, you know, they didn't even write or something. I don't know.
She's a really interesting actress when you look at the sort of pivot in French cinema to more modern, you know, like you had the new wave and then you had sort of modern French cinema, and she's sort of right in the middle there. She also made a bunch of films with Ulrike Ottinger, who was a German filmmaker. And one of the reasons Ulrike said she liked working with Delphine is she'd seen Jeanne Dielman, and she realized that this was a modern actor. This was someone who could handle even postmodern cinema. She could do anything. If she can do this role, she can do anything. And so then she made these like bonkers movies in the 80s with Ottinger, who was also a lesbian filmmaker. And just if you look at the different directors that Seyrig worked with over the course of her 25-year career, she really did work with like everybody, but she is not really talked about as one of the great French actors in America. She is a little bit more now. I think like Criterion Channel had a whole like Delphine Seyrig theme, so people could start to get to know her work a little better here. But she's definitely still somebody where, you know, people will talk about Bardot, or they'll talk about Hubert, or they'll talk about Catherine Deneuve, but then you say Delphine Seyrig and they're like, wait, who? You know, she's like still fourth or fifth in terms of like modern great French actresses, but she could do anything.
I think modern is a perfect word too, because everything about this movie just feels like a watershed almost. And I could, you know, as far as it topping the Sight and Soundless and its lasting influence throughout so much independent cinema, I feel like has this in its DNA. And there's so many movies now that use this and are known. You know, you go to Cannes every year and I'm reading about movies that are 4 hours long and that have minimal action in them and that don't spell things out for you. And it really, something like this just feels so modern, if not postmodern at certain points, that it really does feel like a seminal film. And I know it took a little while for it to be recognized like that.
Yeah. It took, I think this was the third Sight and Sound that it had appeared on. But I one of the big detractors was Paul Schrader, who's always, you know, putting his foot in his mouth. But what I thought was fascinating was that if you look at and this was kind of left out of a lot of hand-wringing, if you look at the director's list, which, you know, a lot of the hand-wringing was like, oh, they stacked the other list with, you know, woke people to have a woke list or whatever. And it's like, no, they actually just finally opened it up to people whose expertise were different. That's not the same thing. But if you look at the director's list, it was number 4. So it was super high on the director's list also. It's just a good movie. And if you look at the directors who had it on their list, it's not all the same kind of director. It's all over the place, the people who are either inspired by this or in awe of this film. So it didn't hit this spot because they gamed the system to make sure they had this happen. It just naturally rose to the top. I also think a big sort of hurdle for a lot of films that have slowly been making it on the list, like African cinema also, is just accessibility. And there's been a change in like boutique labels putting out African classics beyond Tukibuki. Like there's been an actual effort to like, there are more than just 2 African classics and they're available now. Scorsese's done a lot of that. Jeanne Dielman wasn't on Blu-ray until, it wasn't on DVD even until 2002, and then it wasn't on Blu-ray until 2016, or 2017. So it's like, of course it took another 20, it's 20 in that 20 years since it first came on the list, it's been way more accessible. It's been on home video. It's been programmed more people have seen it. So it's not that it just came out of nowhere from a woke mob. It was literally not an available film. And then suddenly people saw it and went, oh my God, where has this film been? And I think a lot of the hand wringing on the opening of the canon is because people are not looking at why was the canon so narrow? Not why is it so wide now? Why was it so narrow? And the answer is almost always accessibility. Not necessarily gatekeeping. I think people get angry if you mention gatekeeping. Gatekeeping, I'm sure, has some aspects of it, but part of gatekeeping literally is accessibility. Are the people who, like the head of Criterion, he had a whole mea culpa about like he passed on Daughters of the Dust and Kino ended up putting it out because he didn't know what that movie was. He didn't understand it. Now he's like, wow, I had a bias. It's like how many of these people that ran boutique labels that had the ability to bring a film like Jeanne Dielman to the wider masses just had an unconscious bias. And it's not necessarily gatekeeping. It's just the accessibility wasn't there. So I think that's why you see a big change and why you saw a film like this in those three lists rise higher and higher was literally just more people saw it.
Yeah, even Vertigo, that's the thing. I know was kind of unavailable for many years after it came out. And you could see how
and what was available were like terrible copies too. Like the versions that were on VHS originally, the color is trash. So, there's a reason. I love Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane's one of my all-time favorite movies, but that movie was always available, and it was always available in a good, like it was one of the very first Criterion Blu-rays in the 80s, or not Blu-rays, Laserdiscs in the 80s. Like that film was always available.
Right,
it was always being played.
Praised from the second it came,
Yeah. So it's less about, I feel like people get really angry when things change without realizing that part of that change is literally just more people got to see this thing. That's it. It's not a conspiracy. It's not, a woke mob. It's literally just more people saw the thing. And you would think someone like Paul Schrader, who has a handful of films that have been long not available, would understand and appreciate that. But he likes to complain. So
we should just state for the record that open invitation, Paul Schrader, anytime you want to come on this podcast and answer for your sins, our door is open.
Oh, that would be the grumpiest episode ever.
He's an interesting guy. I met him at a screening once of American Gigolo, and I asked him to sign my American Gigolo vinyl, and he did, but then he was like, why do you have this? And I was like, what do you mean, why do I have this? But okay. You know what? This is exactly how I expected you to be. I appreciate it.
Well, and going to those two sides about why this movie is suddenly so highly ranked, I was kind of shocked to hear that before 2012, there was only 145 critics who were being polled for this list. And to just think that for like 50, 60 years, this canon was being formed by such a small amount of people. And obviously, most of them were white men, just because that was the nature of film criticism.
And most of them were either white European or white American. So it was very biased towards Europe and America, and then Japan, because Japan has always been the one part of that. I was reading a really interesting book. There used to be an exchange, like several of the studios had an exchange program with Japan. So I think part of the reason Japanese films have always been more well known is there really was like an open exchange of like, here's our prints, send us your prints, and they were less afraid of like exporting their films, or they had their government like backed the exchange of Japanese films. Not to diss, I love classic Japanese cinema. It's like my favorite stuff. But I think, again, it goes to access. So there's all these great other Asian countries that, like Manila and the Claws of Light is one of the big classic Filipino films. And like that came available, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, because of Scorsese. So it's like, I don't know. It's fascinating that it's a combo of there are more critics. And actually, I think last time, 10 years ago, was the first time they included curators and programmers, which is wild because you know that programmers, especially film festival programmers, see thousands more films than critics do, because they're the ones that are seeing all the crap films and going, no, these are the 100 that are actually good. And curators obviously are the ones picking and choosing from the festivals. And it's just fascinating that I think this year was the first year they had like academics and historians. And I'm like, okay, well, academics and historians are the ones that are like in the vaults looking at stuff. How is this not, it seems stupid to me that it took them, was this the sixth one, right? Seventh one, sixth one? I can't do math. 6, 7? 62 to whatever this is.
Yeah, this might even be, I think 52 was actually the very first time that they did it.
Okay, so it's 8?
So we're at 7 or 8.
I'm terrible at arithmetic.
Tony, get that calculator out. No, go ahead.
That it's this many iterations, and they finally were like, we should include historians. It is baffling to me, which makes me really excited. I think it's an interesting list. I love that. I think it was A.O. Scott from the New York Times was like, this wasn't enough disruption. So I'm really excited to see in 10 years when you have a whole new generation of historians. Because one of the things, the more you read about film history, the more you, and historiography, the more you realize that like everything builds on things that were already, like you read this person's paper and you find the gaps and then you research and then, and that's how you unearth things that have always been there, but no one was looking, right? Yeah. And I think what's fascinating about a list like this that's now including the people who are doing that, like that research through archives and finding films that haven't been talked about, and maybe not even lost films, but literally, hey, this film has been sitting in this can. I watched it. It's really interesting. Let's program it at MoMA, right? Like that's fascinating. And I feel like I don't understand the people who are upset when a list like this changes, when all it means is like more films are being talked about, more films are being looked at, more people who know things.
Citizen Kane didn't disappear.
All those lists you can always look at the list. And all it means is the more change that happens means more films for you to discover, more films for baby cinephiles to discover. I don't see how that is a bad thing, literally at all. It makes no sense to me. But I've always been a voracious explorer of cinema. There's not a genre I haven't tried. There isn't an era I haven't tried to watch. There was the year that I didn't watch any Men. I got really sick of Men for a while, and that was a really good palate cleanser. And I've got back onto, I watch plenty of films with men now. But I don't understand not wanting to continue finding more things to know about and to watch. And having a guide like this is...
That should be what these lists are for.
Yeah.
That should be the whole purpose of it. Not just to anoint, the same things over and over.
Exactly.
It always seems very obvious that there is more out there that we're missing. Like that always is the case. That 5 years from now, there's going to be this thing that I totally missed that was happening right now. And let alone something that we're just unearthing from 50 years ago. It's the same with and it is it is proximity and who can get it to where. Even in literature, the biggest thing we're always behind on is translation. Is just we're missing I don't know, especially English speaking readers and viewers are just always missing out on these things because they half of us are I don't give a shit. I don't want to read my movies, or I don't want to read a book that isn't in the original tongue or whatever. I won't get it or something. It's all these silly, weird exclusionary ideas.
It boggles. It really boggles. And to see that work be rewarded in a film like Jeanne Dielman being seen by enough people to now top a list like this, I feel like that should be exciting. I'm sure the people who worked hard on these restorations and got these prints out there and got it more accessible are yes, we did it. But I'm
glad you dragged Paul Schrader so I don't have to, because I was really annoyed when he was with what he was saying and with all the people who were agreeing with him.
The people who were agreeing, I was just you know what? Just watch the movie. You'll enjoy it, I promise. But it's also, there is still some, nascent misogyny in even just talking about women making great films, whether it's in the past or contemporarily. I remember when I did A Year with Women in 2015, I was telling a programmer, and this was like, he's a terrible man, so I'm not surprised now, but it was the guy who was running the Cinefamily in LA at the time, and I told him I was going to do this because the Cinefamily at the time was programming a lot of great films directed by women. I only later realized that it was this woman named KJ that was doing all that programming, and that's why the Cinefamily was good. But I told him I was doing this experiment, and he was like, good luck finding 365 films. And I was like, dude, what? You run a cinema. What kind of thing is that to say?
Yeah, that's crazy.
It was rough. It was rough. But he later got ousted for being a sexual predator. So, you know,
Wow.
but there's for every, you know, open-hearted person, there's still a ton of just very misogynistic people who are like, women don't make great films. Women shouldn't be making films. I remember about 10 years ago, Bret Easton Ellis said he'd only seen one film in his entire life that was good, directed by a woman, that women were inherently like built for making cinema. And I was like, did you know that, like,
Paul Schrader?
Yeah, I was like, do you know that in the silent era, like 50% of the writers were women, and like 25 or more percent of the women, like directors, were women? Like, women built cinema. What are you talking about? They aren't made to make cinema.
A woman directed American Psycho.
His
own book.
I think he hates.
Oh, does he not like?
He hates the adaptation. Yeah, because they turned it into a feminist thing, and I don't think that was his intentions. But it's just there's still a lot of that, and it's frustrating. I think it's getting better, at least in terms of contemporary women. But I do think there's a gap in people watching the films by women. Like Letterboxd just put out their, you know, cap for the end of the year, and they still have to do the 10 most watched films by women and the 10 most watched women directors, because the 10 most watched films are almost never directed by women, and the 10 most watched directors are almost never female directors, because people aren't making it a priority. They aren't. I don't know. It's frustrating to see that they still have to do that because people aren't watching. Also, speaking of American Psycho, Mary Harron is always on the top 10 most watched women, and I think it's because people obsessively rewatch American Psycho, which is wild. I love that movie, but it's like Mary Harron being in the top 10 every year is very strange. Nice. Not to diss Mary Harron, when she hits, she really hits hard. But there's like you just watching the whole Agnes Varda set. She has what, 72? There's like 72 films on there, something like that, between the shorts. That's a lot.
Well, she just made the list for the first time. I mean, just to give some stats there, because now that there were over 1,600 critics, which on this list, which was even in 2012 was their first big revamp. That was like 846. So it was even like double that. And that we went from having just one film by a Black filmmaker, one on the whole top 100 to 7. And women went from 2, which one of them was Jeanne Dielman, and to 11, which still feels like we can do better than that.
Yeah. And 4 of the films are from the same filmmakers, because Jeanne Dielman has 2 and Varda has 2, which seems interesting and a bit reductive at the same time. It's the same way that like Howard Hawks didn't make the list because he has so many bangers that nobody, you know, got split. I feel like Varda and Akerman have so many good films, and so many people were purposeful in adding one Akerman or one Varda to their ballot that 2 from each ended up on there, which I was not surprised. Like News from Home is also a beautiful film, and people love it. I definitely thought that was going to make the top 250 when that gets dropped. I was not expecting it to be in the 100 though, which was a delightful surprise. But I think what it shows, the ones that did show up, is the main thing is what I was saying about access. Like almost every one of the films directed by women, except maybe Daughters of the Dust, were released by Criterion in the last 10 years, last 5 years, actually, other than Jeanne Dielman. So it's interesting to see who the gatekeeping is that kind of access. Like, would Watermelon Woman, great film, would that have made the list if Criterion had actually put Watermelon Woman out instead of, I'm not sure, I think Kino was the one that put that restoration out? Maybe.
It's a big deal. Instead of putting out another Wes Anderson instead, like,
yeah,
why?
But it's also kind of disappointing to see that so many people use Criterion as like a crutch. I love Criterion. I think they really do wonderful work, and they're like the Daisies disc they put together is stunning. All the special features on there are just, I loved it. I spent a whole day watching everything on there. But Susan Seidelman, all of her films, other than Smithereens, which is the one Criterion one, all of her films are on Blu-ray. But you don't see people watching and talking about Susan Seidelman, who's one of the great directors of the 80s. Same for Cheryl Dunye, who did Watermelon Woman. She has several great films, but she was the first Black lesbian to have a film released, a feature film. You don't see people talking about her. Losing Ground was a wonderful independent 80s film that Milestone put out, and it got a little bit of traction, and then Criterion put it on the streaming, and suddenly everyone's talking about it. And it's like, okay, but this was available for like 2 years. What are you doing?
Right. For some reason, it really takes that stamp on things.
Yeah.
Is really what does it for people.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, and one movie that was maybe one that I heard the most bitching about that made the list, which was Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which actually, some people were complaining because it was so recent, and I don't know. It did rank at like number 30, which does seem awfully high. I think I was one of the people who was a little down on it too. Just thinking like, to your point, that I think the main reason was because it has that whole, was that A24 who put that out?
It was Neon.
Okay.
Neon in the United States.
Right. Yeah. So it had a lot of publicity. It's a very, a Twitter friendly kind of movie, and I think just a lot of people saw it. And
both Parasite and Portrait of a Lady on Fire were Neon releases, and they put all their Oscar money towards Parasite, interestingly enough.
And it just makes me wonder, like, it's a good movie, I like it, fine, but when there are still so many other filmmakers, I think, who have made better, more lasting films than that by women.
What I will say about Portrait of a Lady on Fire is when I interview female directors, and last year I did it was a weekly column, so I interviewed and then I did a bunch of TIFFs. So I think I interviewed about 65, 70 women, including several cinematographers last year, and there were several women who came up multiple times, and when I asked who's inspired you or who's a filmmaker that you should seek out or a film that people should watch, and it was who you kind of expect. It was a lot of Varda, a lot of Campion, a lot of Bigelow, a lot of all things, Lynn Ramsey and Andrea Arnold. But the film that showed up the most when I spoke to cinematographers was Portrait of a Lady on Fire. There's something about the visuals of that film, but every cinematographer I spoke to mentioned that film, and I think 5 or 6 of the younger female directors mentioned that film. So it's kind of like I'm gonna go somewhere. Taylor Swift's Folklore, right? Beloved film or beloved album. 4 or 5 younger artists made albums inspired by Folklore within a year or two of Folklore being released, right? Olivia Rodrigo? Is that how you say her name? Sour was one. There was several others. But if you go on the Wikipedia for Folklore, it's like there's already 5 or 6 women who were inspired by that album to make similar albums, right? I think Portrait of a Lady on Fire is a watershed film in that it inspired so many young women, whether they're cinematographers or directors, in a way that The Piano did 30 years earlier. And I think that that film shouldn't have to wait. The Piano just made the list. Took basically 22 of these lists for The Piano to hop on it. I don't think Sciamma's film should have to wait if it's already that influential. That's sort of that's my take on that. But it's not information that I think you would have unless you're talking to these women, because it doesn't seem as influential. But another film that is equally had an influence right away was The Virgin Suicides. So many women who were teenagers when The Virgin Suicides came out 10 years later. I have a whole list somewhere of films that visually were inspired by The Virgin Suicides because they were teens when it came out, and then now they're filmmakers, and that's what they're referencing. And I think I actually was really excited to see that film be on there because I have seen its impact already just on filmmakers. So I guess because so many women and so many Black filmmakers have had to wait for so long, I don't mind that films that are less than 5 years old made it. I think Moonlight being on there, Parasite being on there, Get Out being on there, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire being on there, those were watershed moments. I don't think you should have to wait 10 years to see it if the impact is already being felt by filmmakers.
Right,
well, yeah, and a lot of movies
later is when we are going to see
lists.
That stuff sprout for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and the recency thing is not. Yeah, I have no problem with that. And it is just looking through the list, and there are only 100 slots.
It is wild. I do agree that it is wild that it was that high. I think what that shows is that there were strategic people who were like, I'm going to include one film by a woman. And you can see that the ones that were on most ballots were Jeanne Dielman, Beau Travail, Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Those were the 3 films that were on, and probably Cleo. Those were the 4 that were like on the most. People who were thinking, I'm going to include at least one film by a woman. That's what they did. My ballot was all films directed by women because I remember when the 2012 list came out, it took a while, but eventually they put every single critic list on the website. And I was thinking, this was first of all, I did not think I was going to get a ballot. I have bitched about lists for a long time. I'm always like, these lists are terrible. And so I thought I was like not wanted. But maybe me bitching about the list is why they added me. I don't know. I don't ask questions. But I decided that what I wanted to do with this list was have if someone like me 10 years ago, who was sort of just starting out being a cinephile, stumbles on my list, me, 36-year-old me, and sees it, and it's 10 films they've never heard of, I want them to be like, wow, why have I not heard of this, and find them, right? And so that's why I did all films directed by women, because I was like, these are the films I would want somebody to stumble on, and maybe they're not going to be on anyone else's list. Although I think Manohla Dargis also had Shoes, which is a silent film from 1916, and I was like, there's 2 of us. 2 of us have Shoes. But that was my
interesting because it's a different idea than a lot of people have about like lists, like that they try and boil down some sort of like overarching like
metric
formula that they can plug in to figure out like what greatness is or something, where it's more like people using their platforms in order to like you're sending off a time capsule into the future, right? For someone to unearth.
It's not that the films I put on there I don't consider as great. Like every film on there I think is as great as The Red Shoes or The Thin Red Line or any other film directed by a man that I might have put on there. They're as great, but people don't need guidance to find The Thin Red Line. They don't need guidance to see The Red Shoes. They don't need guidance to see Citizen Kane or even Children of Paradise. Those are all available. They're all streaming on Criterion. Someone's going to stumble on it. They're on the previous lists. But and maybe I had one for me because I love Little Women, the Gillian Armstrong Winona Ryder Little Women. So I don't think people need help to find that either, but that was a film for me. But like Shoes is a film that every time I bring it up, people are like, what is this movie? And I'm like, ah. So that was a film I felt like this might be the only way they'll find it. Or there's a Ukrainian film from 1966 called Wings that I love. And I stumbled on it because it was on back when Criterion did those Eclipse sets, where they were like really cheap.
Love the Eclipse.
Whatever. Yeah, they don't do those anymore. And they put her other film, The Ascent, on its own, like standalone Blu-ray, but Wings is still just on this SD version. And it's such a beautiful film. And it's one of my all-time favorites. And I was like, you know what? I only found it because I was purposely trying to like watch all the films on the Criterion collection that were directed by women back when it was like 9 films. And that's how I found it. But it's like, how's someone else going to find this film? And so that was, I actually did a Twitter poll for my very last pick because I had 4 films from American filmmakers from the 70s that I was unsure how well known the films were. And so I put it on Twitter and I wanted to see like, have you seen this film? Right. Looked at the votes and whatever had the least amount of votes, that's the one I put on my list.
Well, yeah.
And it had the least by like a very wide margin. It was like 2 people had seen this film and I was like, clearly that's the film that needs help. So I figured That's how I'm going to contribute to the canon.
Well, and that's the thing.
I don't really want to
Everyone
contribute to
treats their
canon. I want to
ballot
like guide
exactly.
people.
Some people want to use their ballot to what they think the canon should be. Some people are using it as these are my 10 personal, favorite movies, and then other ones like you are using it to bring exposure to films that you want to give more exposure to. And it's interesting to see the results of this poll when there's all these different. It's not one goal that every contributor had.
Yeah, and I think that's why that also is why I felt like I thought it was going to have more change up, because I thought there would be more people doing the like these are my favorites or these are a guide post kind of thing, and feels like there were still a lot of people that were in awe of the canon and wanted to perpetuate, which is fine, because it's the thing about film is it's a personal relationship, and whatever it is that you feel you want to contribute is fine. I think that it was your ballot, and I just know that I would not feel right if I hadn't used it to like try to guide people to films that maybe they would never, but I might be the only one that has some of those films on my list, and hopefully that gets people to watch it. I really didn't expect anyone else to have Shoes. When I saw it on Manohla Dargis's list, I was like, okay, all right, there's two of us. Because her previous list, her 2012 list, she didn't have any films directed by women on it.
Yeah, so I would like to see in future years, I would love to see, in 10 years from now, and again, you only have 10 lists on your ballot. Maybe they can start giving people 20 spots or something like that. That would be nice. But I'd like to see some, Kelly Reichardt, Marinade.
Kelly Reichardt should be on there, yeah.
Julia Lochtev, Lynn Ramsey you brought up, Lucretia Martel. I started thinking of all of these different ones. Like, where are these filmmakers too, who are pretty well known?
There wasn't a lot of South America at all on there. I don't think any, which is wild considering how many like landmark films have come out of Central and South America. But I think it again leads to access. It's just really access and people being afraid to go outside of their comfort zone. Like Africa is another one that like the two African films that made it are the two African films you expect to make it, Tuki Buki and Black Girl. And they're great films, and that's where you start with African cinema. But the more African cinema you watch, the more you know it is a rich continent with a rich cinematic history. But those films are so hard to find, and I don't know how to fix that. One thing I always do when I cover like film festivals is I look for films directed by women, films from Africa, and those are the two that I try to watch the most, because in particular, Eastern European films by women and any films from anybody from Africa that isn't like made by a European person has the hardest time of getting distribution in America. And so seeing it in a festival might be my one shot. So I pretty much do a lot of my, if I am in a space like a film festival, or if I'm given a ballot or something like that, I always do it very strategic, because I've been doing this long enough to know when is my last shot to see something, or what is my best shot to see something. And then if I see it, maybe I can talk about it enough to convince a distributor to take a chance on it. I don't know. I did that with a Japanese film actually that I saw at a festival last summer, and it still doesn't have distribution. And it was Japan's pick for the Oscars. It still doesn't have distribution. And I'm like, but I tried.
Well, yeah, we'll turn to you then, I think, for knowing that critics are, who are out there trying to pick out these corners that don't get attention. I think that's something that your readers will know is kind of your thing, and that's you're somebody that we can go to for that purpose.
like Maya Cade, who founded the Black Film Archive, which was literally just a way to get more people to know these Black films exist, and here's how you can watch them. It's a really great tool to fill in those blind spots. And she's somebody who also, I think her entire ballot was from Black filmmakers, because she felt like this is her chance to try to highlight some of these films that have been overlooked, whether purposefully or unconscious bias wise. I think purposeful, that's the whole point of curation is to be purposeful about like, this needs to be seen, this needs to be known. And I think more and more people who have an outside the box sort of thought process are being given this opportunity. Like I mentioned, my friend KJ, who started at Cinefamily, and then she was at UCLA for a while, and she programmed right before the quarantine hit. Almost everything she programmed was directed by women at UCLA. So she was getting that, you know, that audience of slightly older museum audience and then younger students. And she was exposing them to all kinds of crazy stuff. And then now she's at the Academy Museum doing the exact same thing, programming things that Academy, you know, museum, the kind of people who would go to the Academy Museum would not necessarily watch 90% of what she's programming, but now they will. And I think that's really exciting. Because, you know, we've seen Citizen Kane. Like, I have personally seen Citizen Kane on the big screen 5 times. Like, that movie is not going anywhere. But some of these other films, like, I had to wait. I just saw The Piano on the big screen last year. Just saw it. Like, that's crazy.
And it's definitely been, like a goal on this podcast, too, of being this sort of angle of using the platform, both, even though it is sort of on the surface, has this sort of like, maybe trying to lure in people who are like, oh, like I like really difficult, weird, gross, like show me or like really bad things or something like that. But quite often we are trying to slip these in here and there, like the films of Michael Haneke or something like that.
Yeah.
Or like this film of course is also this like, okay, you can do this. I don't know, and especially to audiences that think that they have already they all have their rules on what they like and what they don't like, and I don't know, rather than us making a podcast about just like movies that we think you should like, it has been this sort of interesting way of still working that in, almost in a more effective way, I think sometimes.
I think it's a really smart way to get people. I mean, I think the whole concept of Unwatchable, like there's a lot of films that are called difficult or they're called bad. And then you're like, but who called it difficult? Who called it bad? Right. Maybe they're looking at it from the wrong angle. And I think a podcast like this can help viewers maybe level set of like, here's how to approach this film. And now it's not unwatchable. I think that's really smart. I mean, I think a lot of
scared.
Yeah. I think a lot of boutique, distributors are doing similar things, like the American Genre Film Archive. They've partnered with Vinegar Syndrome, and they've put out all kinds of films that haven't been deemed, you know, worthy. But they put out this crazy shot on VHS film called Limbo that is like kind of a horror film. It's like if you actually plugged into David Lynch's brain with like a VHS camera, like maybe this is what it would look like. And it's a film I saw programmed, I think, at UCLA of all things when they were celebrating AGFA. And now it's on Blu-ray, although I don't know why you would put a shot on VHS on Blu-ray, but that's neither here nor there. But it's one of those films that like those, but like those guys saw the value in what this film is. And I think that's, and they gave you the tools of how to approach it. Like it's shot on VHS. It's supposed to look like trash. She shot it on VHS. Like don't expect it, you know, to be, just go with what it is. The vibe is like shot on VHS. You found it in a garage sale kind of feeling kind of movie. It's fascinating.
And
Seth, how do you not know this movie? Out of
your way, you see.
Have you seen it?
I've heard of it and I want to see it.
Oh, it's good. I mean, yeah, I think you will like it. I feel like it's good for people who are willing to like understand what she's doing with it.
I love the
I had a blast. I bought the Blu-ray. I was like, I can't believe this is out. It felt like one of those movies like I know I saw it and like 10 people at UCLA saw it, but now hopefully more people will see it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we make sure that guy who was in the theater with you for Jeanne Dielman gets to see it.
Yeah.
We need to expand his horizons.
I don't have a TV though, so I just listen to classical music, one song a night, and then me and my son we get out the sofa bed and we go to bed. That's it. What a sofa bed she has.
We were fascinated by that.
Really depressing.
Also, like really startling when you're in that rhythm. For all of a sudden, I thought they were like going insane. I didn't know what was going to happen when they started moving furniture around and like making room for the sofa bed. I was like, "What are you guys doing? What are they doing, Marc? What are they doing?" Which again,
the way she puts his like the way she puts his pajamas like in the sofa bed, terrifying.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
Like how much dust gets on his clothes all folded in like that? I don't want to think about it.
Just because every second for her has to be filled with some sort of caretaking act of some sort that he will not give a shit about.
And, coming off of that, I do want to get everybody's opinion on approaching this through a feminist lens and even a queer lens, because it does get that label a lot, which is something I'm not sure Akerman was totally comfortable with those kind of labels or any kind of label. And this is something where she isn't technically she's not a housewife because her husband is not around, but there is definitely a lot of weight that comes along with doing domestic chores, which are traditionally seen as in the realm of the feminine. So you in one way it fits in perfectly with that in that sense, and then in another it's not necessarily her being a woman that is defining whatever psychologically is going on with her, and you can project a lot onto it because of how little we get. But I am interested in what you guys think about that. One thing I'll say is that the little bit of exposition we do get from the letter from her sister, and then there is a scene early on where her son is asking her, how she married, and she does explicitly say that, well, marrying was just the thing to do. The guy was even kind of known as ugly. Making love is something that's just more of a detail, and you can see that is where she's coming from. And honestly, if I had any criticism of this movie, it was I could have even done without that, to even take it to more of an extreme where it wasn't giving me so much to latch on to, which most of the film does not at all. But I think that maybe that's what you can latch on to the most at
the end of the night.
He had some weird ideas about what sex is like, penetrative sex is like.
Oh my god, yeah, like stabbing with a knife.
It's just really interesting that like at the end of the night is when we can finally, like, all of a sudden, like, you have these things to say to me, and all of a sudden we have a lot to say, but shut up, let's turn the lights off. This is too weird or something. But
and of course, her being a sex worker is significant too, and how that culminates
without him
end.
knowing it. Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, I read one read of it. You talked about her mussed hair. I read one read of it that she supposedly has an orgasm, and that's the one thing you can't control. Like, you can't control your body when that happens, and like that's what shoots her whole day off. And I was like, that's an interesting way to read that moment.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's true. When I first watched it, I thought the guy had maybe like beat her up a little bit, because that was the read I had. And now I'm like, wow, which one of these reads is it? Or is any of these reads it? Who knows?
Or is it just another symptom of her not having, things together like she usually does?
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I think to your point about the housework, living in the feminine, I think you can read it a couple of ways. I think that's purposeful. You can either read it, especially as it's presented, very dance-like at the beginning. It's presented as a very loving portrait of this woman, and it was somewhat inspired by her mother. I think not the prostitute side of things, but the fact that her mother was a sex worker, not prostitute, but her mother was a homemaker her whole life. That was her life, and keeping the house clean and keeping it neat and keeping it orderly after living through the war and all the horrors of the war was her mother's life's purpose. And so I think you see it filmed really lovingly, because Akerman appreciates the way her mother, was kind of a cold woman, but showed love through that, showed love through making the bed, showed love through making food, showed love through keeping the house nice for her. And I think Akerman really wants people to think about that, and think about this as an act of love, and housekeeping as an act of love. But then you can also read it, especially when things start to go wrong, as her being trapped. She has to do these dishes. The son because that's how she expressed love to her son. Her son now can't take care of himself. He can't even clean his own dishes. He can't clean his shoes.
He is useless.
He can barely he can barely make his own coffee, And then her few moments outside the house, she has her little routines, and when that gets messed up, it's like, that when the woman's sitting in her table because she came an hour later, like it's horrible.
Oh, the look she has on her face.
It's devastating. And she's like, isn't, so and so here? And she's like, no, she got off an hour ago. And you're like, no, you messed up. But so I think you can see it both ways. You can see the expression of love and Akerman appreciating that love, but you can also see the trap and the cage that her mother found herself in, whether it was purposeful or not, whether, the goals that were set forth for this generation of women also caged them. And I think Akerman can see both things and hold both things as true at the same time. She can appreciate it and love it and see it for the art that it is and still see it as a cage also. Because the women had to. That's why so many women in the 60s died of barbiturate overdoses, because they found, sometimes you could find, yourself and value in that. And other times it was too much. And then you have an overdose of pills that you probably should never have had. I think it's just a complex, I think that's why feminism has always, and specifically like white American feminism has always had, a lot of complexities to it, is that both things can be true at once, and various phases of feminism have rejected aspects in trying to claim suppression and things like that. And it's like, well, it's both. Like some women, they loved it until they didn't, or they grew up thinking they should love it, and that caused the psychological problems. And so it's more complicated than just oppression. And I think this movie shows that really eloquently.
Yeah, I think that's part of what makes it so great. And you could even, again, Akerman is known as a queer filmmaker, and there's a lot of queer characters in a lot of her other films. And with this one, the character's sexuality is still something that's left kind of ambiguous, because is the reason that she is kind of dismissive about her former husband, and perhaps this unhappiness that she has with the kind of sex work that she does could be, could that be based in her being queer? Could it be based just on her not even being closed off to sexual feelings in general? Is that not even part of the issue?
And what's great about it is that it could be all of those things. There is no answer. I think that's the other reason why a film like this can be difficult, especially with American audiences that have been spoon-fed happy endings and conclusive endings and everything tied up in a bow, is like this is a movie that as many times as you watch it, you come away with more questions than answers every time.
It begs for interpretation, and that is like sometimes my criteria for like a great piece of art sometimes, that it can be this and it can also be that. There's so many ways of looking at it, and it's all of those things that you can at once quite often. And like whether it's for instance, the big act at the end are you linking it to feminist critique, or are you linking it to her place in society is what is causing her to be like this? You can interpret that fine. There's also,
or is it none of those things, and yes, she just had anger boiling and was like, fuck it.
Yeah,
who knows?
That we are getting this very intimate portrait of this person, but at the end of the day, we still are only acting like we know her. We are like, even our interpretations are these like sort of loaded things that like we don't know this person by the end of this movie, and especially we don't know why anyone, and like including her, would actually cross this barrier, right, to like do this act at the end of this movie. Of course, which of course we're dancing around, but I guess we can talk about, if you've gotten this far.
Slight spoiler alert.
Yeah.
I love watching it this last time, that the very last sequence where she's sitting at the table for like 5 minutes, going through like all the emotions. I had not realized how many movies stole that. Like The Long Good Friday ends that way. Michael Clayton ends that way. There's another one from a couple years ago that ends in a very similar way. I think a lot of the other films are riffing on The Long Good Friday because they're all like men sitting in cars. But The Long Good Friday, I rewatched the end of it just to see. I think The Long Good Friday, he was riffing on this. And so all these other filmmakers,
right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think my theory, this is like my like galaxy brain theory, is that all these other filmmakers were aping The Long Good Friday, not realizing that came from Jeanne Dielman. So it's like the influence is even not direct, which is how you know it's a great film.
That ending is so riveting, just her sitting in that chair. And it is like you are definitely rushing as a viewer to swing from interpretation to interpretation, like, oh man, okay, like what did I miss? How did we get here? I gotta like, maybe if I watch this movie again like 4 times, I'll understand or something. And like, but she's still sitting there and not letting you in and still not telling you anything. And if anything, just like continue, you feel like doors closing in front of you. If anything, like, which is the opposite of what we want an ending to be, which is ideally doors are opening, we are understanding, right? Feels like she has the final victory in the end of like, we are not allowed and we don't know. And talk about the sound in that is just the creak and shift of her weight makes the chair make a noise. And that's like basically all we hear other than the traffic noise outside. And it is just like, it's part of the music of the film. It's wild.
And you keep waiting for her son to come home. And like an American movie, the son would come home, right?
Yep.
No, you don't know what's going to happen when the son comes home. You don't know if she's going to deal with the situation before he comes home. You don't know.
But you can make a story up in your head, and
it's like,
but it's not important what happens when the son gets home.
No, it's a wonderful film. I love films that end kind of obliquely like that, where you just, I don't know, like I'm going to have that 7 different, every time I watch it, I'm going to have a different reason of why it happened, why it ended that way.
Do you know anything about the constant light, like flicker?
Those flashing lights that come through the window that seem so timed.
I feel like it has to do with what part of Brussels she's living in. I think it has to do. I'm not 100% sure because I have not actually looked this up, but I think she's living near maybe the port or something, and it might be a port light. It feels that's what it feels like. The last time I watched it, it felt like it was, like a port light, or definitely not an airport light, but what are they called? Why can't I think of the word? The lighthouse. There we go. Like a lighthouse or something like
interesting.
that.
Yeah, I figured it was traffic or something. Like it almost seemed like not a bad, like almost like a cheap effect, but it looks beautiful, and I'm not sure what it's trying to replicate.
I feel like if you're familiar with Belgium or with Brussels, that probably Brussels audiences are like, I know what that's supposed to be, but I've never actually read what it's supposed to be, so I don't know.
Just another thing that's the people in the world of the movie would know that we don't. And a lot of things are left like that. But speaking of endings, I want to give everyone a chance to kind of do just a little summary. Usually at this point in the podcast is where we would say, if we could, would we unwatch this film? But I don't think that's really in the conversation for this movie.
No.
Because
although I feel like I wish I had seen it for the first time on the big screen, because that sound design was so much different, and it added a whole other texture to it that I think my many rewatches of the Blu-ray might have been even richer if I'd started with knowing exactly what that sound was like.
And without having it spoiled, probably.
Yes, also I would have liked to not have had it spoiled. That would have been great. It's still impactful if you are spoiled, but I feel like especially that audience, I don't know how many people knew what was coming, and there was like jump scare type jumps. That was glorious.
Yeah, 3-hour build up to the biggest jump scare ever
of all time.
So well, I'll start off with closing thoughts then, so that we can give Mariah the last word on it. But as seeing this for the first time, it really was the perfect circumstances for me. And again, it's a movie that nobody should be scared of. You should be excited to go into it and to see something that's genuinely exciting and radical feeling, and it really just felt like a towering experience for me. And I do think it's a great film, and experience is the key word, that this is a visceral ordeal that, you're going through, and you are in the hands of somebody who has complete confidence in what she's doing. And speaking of the director, and that's, you should, if you don't be scared about the 3.5 hours, that it's going to be well spent. And if you can, I would also encourage you to watch it start to finish and not try to break it up, which is probably tempting that a lot of people want to do, but you really will feel the difference by having gone through the whole thing. That's really how this is built. And by the time you get to the end, I think it's going to play a lot differently if you're in it for the entire ride all the way through. So definitely not unwatching this one, but what about you, Seth?
I mean, I agree with everybody. It's an excellent experience is the word for sure. And I can't stress enough that I would recommend it to people as like a way into more difficult cinema, even though it seems like might be like a tough first sit through or something like that. I don't know, especially in our day and age where there's just such a we're all like watching each other do the most mundane things on social media, or like I go over to my parents' house and they're watching like some lady like painting a wall, like and it's just like showing them how it's obviously has the how-to aspect to it, but like at the same time it's just like we spend so much more time than I think we ever have like taking in like non-narrative, like quote unquote, like
if you can watch a whole hour-long YouTube tutorial on how to make some food dish, you can watch this movie.
Yeah, there's something to that like we also are all so interested in podcasts, which quite often, like, yes, they have something to do with your interests, but everybody I talk to there's another lingering element to it that they just like hearing the word and the spoken word, people talking. I don't know, it really does point to that there's something of a want for the minimal maybe with what we're taking in, even though we wind up cutting it up in really like flashy, ridiculous ways. I think, like dive in, we'll see this movie for sure.
I guess I will say when I was plotting my Sight and Sound ballot, I had 82 initial filmmakers, and Jeanne Dielman was the number one that I had. I had that on my ballot, and then I took the other 81 women and I whittled it down to 9. So Jeanne Dielman was always my number one. And I was a little shocked when it landed, but like happy shocked, not like how dare this shocked, because it was the one film I was like, if this film isn't higher on this list, what is the point of this list anymore? So I think that I'm glad the list did what it did. I'm glad it made people angry. I hope it made more people want to seek it out. Obviously, people listening to this podcast are going to want to seek it out. I would hope. And it's absolutely worth watching. It's absolutely worth watching the rest of her filmography as well. Because she has, like we talked about with News from Home and Hotel Monterey, other sort of slow cinema style stuff. But she has a musical that also has Delphine Seyrig in it called Golden 80s, if you like musicals. She has anti-colonial films she has a bunch of documentaries in the 90s about immigration. Like she pretty much did every kind of film. And I think she has been one of the great filmmakers of the latter half of the 20th century from the word go, and is finally being talked about in the same way that all the men from the 70s were. And frankly, someone like Martin Scorsese probably is like, it's about time. Although I don't know, he didn't have Jeanne Dielman on his ballot, so I don't know. But the fact that we talked about someone like Scorsese right away as great when she was the same age making monumental cinema, it tells you a lot about how these lists are created, what we value as a canon, and how much longer it takes women and people of color to. I mean, the fact that I think I mentioned Daughters of the Dust a few times. Sorry to like move over again, but that she's the only Black woman, the only woman of color on this entire list. And Daughters of the Dust is a monumental film, but there are so many others that should be on there as well. And it's shocking that, much like Jeanne Dielman, it's probably going to take another 10, 20 years for more women of color to even make the list. It's depressing. But the more you watch things like Jeanne Dielman and the more we talk about them, the more access to these other films will happen. More people will watch Watermelon Woman. More people will watch Losing Ground. More people will watch all of these films. And then the next year's list, maybe it'll be less shocking because people have actually watched the films and they're like, oh shit, women are great filmmakers, always have been, always will be. They should be regarded in the same way. It shouldn't be shocking. What's shocking is that it took this long. Really, that's the most shocking thing. That and the shoe polish. Sorry, I was making a joke.
Absolutely shocking. It's a slasher movie, I swear. It just takes a long time to get there.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, well, hey, 10 years from now, we'll check back in when we're on the 10th or 11th season of the podcast. That's when we'll see exactly what happens.
We'll see.
Well, I don't want to let you go either without asking you, Marya, about this book that you're working on. I don't know how much you can talk about it or how far in you are.
I can. So I'm. It's with Rizzoli, which is the mostly like photo book style books, but it's a collection of interviews and imagery from what I'm calling visionary filmmakers. Right now, it's tentatively called Cinema Her Way: Visionary Filmmakers in Their Own Words. That title may change, who knows. But essentially, I'm talking to 20 to 25. The goal is 25. We'll see if I get that many contemporary, currently working, or at least not dead yet women. They would not let me write about Lois Weber. So I'm gonna mention Lois Weber. She's the one that did Shoes in the intro. Okay. But it'll be long form interviews, sort of talking through their entire filmography. So far, I have talked to Isabel Sandoval, Betty Gordon, and Gillian Armstrong. And then I have several other women that I've contacted and I'm in the midst of trying to nail down. But it will hopefully be a broad spectrum of kinds of filmmakers, of ages, of pretty much every variety of kind of film. I want to talk to documentarians and a couple of different languages, and as much as I can get in 20 to 25 women, which obviously my initial pitch was 365 different profiles. And even that was hard to whittle down to 365. So whittling it down to like 20 to 25 has been literal torture. But the interviews themselves have been very rewarding. I spoke to Betty Gordon for like 6 hours. It was amazing. She's probably the only filmmaker who's going to talk to me that long because she had a lot to say, and I was very grateful to be the receiving end of it. But I'm really a big proponent of oral history because, especially with women filmmakers, there's so many filmmakers that I have read about or I've watched their films, and then I go to look for interviews, and there's nothing. And it's getting a little better. Women in Film does really bare minimum interviews with almost anyone that's at a festival, which is good. So you're starting to get a little bit more. But the kind of in-depth oral histories that you see for male filmmakers just don't really exist for women. And obviously I can't go back and like talk to Varda or Akerman or some of these women who have passed recently. Jo Micklin Silver was someone I love, and she has a handful of interviews, but nothing to the scope of her entire career, which is a real bummer. So my goal is to have these definitive interviews with these 20 to 25 women that maybe, again, much like my Sight and Sound thing, maybe 10 years from now, someone just learns about Betty Gordon and they want to know everything. Here you go. So that's the goal. It's due at the end of next year, so it'll probably come out in 2024. So it'll be a hot minute, and then they're picking imagery to go with it. So the women choose the photos or the stills from their films that they want to represent their work.
All right. Well, that is exciting. We'll be looking forward to that. Maybe we can touch base with you again at some point when you get closer to actually releasing that. So is there anything else that you want to plug or put out there?
I think you mentioned my Substack already, but every Friday I do a Directed by Women viewing guide, and it's usually 2 to 3 new releases, like that you can either go to the theater, stream, rent, but are brand new relatively. And then 3 to 4 streaming picks on various services like Criterion Channel or Netflix, or most recently I've been diving into Ovid. Ovid has a lot of like random things you've never heard of, documentaries and world cinema, which is really fun. Just solely for awareness purposes. I write a little bit about like why I like the film, why you should watch it. And I try to keep it to things that maybe you've never heard of, maybe a filmmaker you've heard of, but you haven't seen this film, that kind of stuff, to just broaden awareness. Because like I said, when I originally pitched this, I had 365 women, and that was hard to whittle it down for me. But every publisher that looked at that was like, we can't sell this. No one's heard of any of these women. And I'm like, what? Like, there's thousands of women. So if you find that like knowing the names of women directors is sort of a blind spot for you, and you would like to learn more and watch films that you've never heard of, I have that guide every Friday.
All right.
Yep.
And it's every kind of genre, same thing, like everything from horror to documentaries to thrillers to action films, although there aren't that many. But when they are, I always mention them because, women get pigeonholed into what kind of films they make. And the truth is they have always made every kind of film, even going back to the 1900s. So.
Yeah, they are not all Jeanne Dielman.
No, there's westerns,
means.
There's action movies. There were a lot of action movies in the teens, actually. A lot of female directors made serial. They were the serial queens, and a lot of those stunt women like co-directed those films. So.
All right. Well, thank you. This was a real pleasure, and
I enjoyed talking about this film. Anytime someone wants to go deep on this movie, I'm here for it. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we were excited to get to have you on here for this, especially now that we know this was at the top of your Sight and Sound Pulse. So
yeah, it was like this was it, and then everything else I'll figure it out.
Yeah, I can only imagine the feeling of seeing that it won. And what we know about our listeners based on the analytics that we get from Anchor is that our listeners are majority male. So I just want to say, fellas, we'll get them next time. We got a decade to get Fight Club to the top of that list. So
God.
Don't despair.
Oh yeah, we'll keep trying.
Thanks so much for throwing that in, Tony.
Yeah.
Someday I'll share my David Fincher stories. I worked on Mank. I have stories.
Boy.
Oh boy.
Yes.
Well, yeah, it seems appropriate that we could maybe get this particular podcast episode up to 3 hours. But
we should.
maybe some other time.
I'm telling you, slow podcasting.
Slow. One time I did a podcast about westerns, and we had to film it over 2 days because it ended up being like 6 hours. So I've definitely done that.
Whoa.
Oh man, I think we should amp it up though, like with like some silence, like with like adding silence to the podcast too.
Yeah, I mean, we could take a break. Yeah, to make it
when
dinner.
Seth and I got on.
All right, fine. We're not.
I love that idea.
Unwatchables is produced by Tony Scarpitti, hosted by me, Marc Dottavio, and Seth Troyer, with artwork by Micah Kraus. You can find Seth and I on Letterboxd under Marc Dottavio and Sloth Troyer. You can also check us out at unwatchablespod.com for links to our Twitter and Instagram, or support us on Patreon for bonus content and to have a say in what we watch. Thanks for listening.